Before we get started, just a shout out to today's date. Of course, the English calendar, today's date has a lot of meaning and a lot of things to think about and focus on. But in the Hebrew calendar as well, today is Chai Elul, the 18th day of the month of Elul. And it is the birthday of both the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, which are names you might recognize from last week, which they are the founder of the Hasidic movement in general. The Baal Shem Tov was the one who revealed the Hasidic philosophy into the world. And the Alter Rebbe, who was his disciple's disciple, who really took it to the next level, including writing the book of Tanya, the book that we're going to be studying, and the framework that we have. And so,
18th century.
This is 18th century, yes. And the Alter Rebbe passed away at the beginning of the 19th century. So that's the... And so when we, of course, it's an auspicious day to learn their Torah, to connect to them, and Hasidim have a play on words that they use. That, of course, 18 in Judaism is not random. It's a powerful number. It's a number of life, and so they say the 18th day of Elul is a day that gives us an energy, gives us an excitement into the month of Elul. What's the month of Elul about? About returning to God, about doing teshuvah, about preparing for the new year. And when we do it within the framework and with the understanding of the world through the Hasidic dimension, that really gives us an energy and a vitality. We're not doing it out of route or out of habit or because we feel forced into it. We're doing it from a place of energy and vitality, which that is enriched by the study and learning of Hasidus, which we are about to do. And so we are on page 25, and as a quick recap, which really, this is one of those weeks, I apologize, I'm going to try to have extra copies most weeks, but yeah. What we discussed last week, which really is the first half of chapter 1, was really an introduction. It was essentially a bunch of questions that the Alter Rebbe asked to make us question what we understand, and then he's going to spend the next 12, 13 chapters slowly answering them. And our main premise was that the concept of a righteous person, of a tzaddik, and the concept of a wicked person, of a rasha, and the intermediary person, a beinoni, we don't really understand those terms. Because the way we would normally translate them, as a pretty good guy, a pretty bad guy, and a sort of average guy, those don't hold up in the literal translations and sort of the actual meanings that we've discussed last time. And so now the Alter Rebbe will start explaining and describing his premise and his understanding. And the main premise of the next very long while of the Tanya is the concept of, good morning, of the two souls. And here we go on page 25. Ach be'er inyan api ma shekasav Rav Chaim Vital zal b'shar kedusha de l'chol ish Yisrael echad tzadik v'echad rasha yesh shtei neshames tichsiv u'neshames ani asisi. On the English side, all these questions and concepts can be explained according to something Rabbi Chaim Vital writes in Shar HaKadusha, and in Eitz Chaim, Portal 50, Section 2. There he explains that every Jewish person, whether a tzaddik or a rasha, has two souls. As it is written, when a spirit emerges from within me and closes itself in the body, I have made souls, plural. Right? So although that verse is talking about one person, it still uses the plural of souls. And so Rabbi Chaim Vital, who is the chief student and really the conduit for the Arizal, the famous Kabbalist, the Arizal, his teachings really come to us through Rabbi Chaim Vital. And he explains that this is telling us that every Jewish person, no matter their status, no matter who they are, they have two souls. Shehein shtei nefashos, these two souls are two entire persons. And so we'll take a moment to unpack and really understand, what is a soul? That word is thrown around so much. I think it's even a genre of music these days. Right? So what is a soul? When we talk the word soul, and so generally speaking, the word soul, as we're going to use it, is talking about a life force. It's talking about an energy, something that powers us, something that causes us, gives us life. Right? What's the difference between a person who is alive and, God forbid, someone who's not alive? Whether or not their soul is active, it's connected to the body. The body is a bunch of cells. The body is essentially the same, or exactly the same, when someone's alive and when someone's not alive. And the difference is whether or not there's a soul there powering it. Now, on the side of the neshama, which we may be more familiar with, or which is really going to be the next chapter. Chapter 2 talks about the neshama a lot more. That then we start getting into differences about, there's the 5 different levels, and there's a lot of that we're going to discuss about that soul. But at its essence, when we call something a soul, we're referring to that life force, that energy, that power, that battery that's causing someone to move. But as Alter Rebbe says, that these two souls are not just souls, it's not just, a battery, the same battery. You put it into a remote, you put it into a car, you put it into a computer. Essentially, obviously, there's different battery technologies, but the same AA battery can go into a wide range of products, from your toothbrush to your remote control to a child's toy.
It's the spark, the power.
It's the power. That's all it is. The souls that power us, our neshamos, especially these two that we're going to be discussing, there are a lot more. They are, I think you can call them personas. These two souls, depending on what is powering us, there's different things that are going on. We have different attributes, we have different personalities, as we're going to unpack over the next chapter and a half. Page 26. The first soul, the Alter Rebbe is going to start off by discussing soul number 1. Nefesh achas mitzad haklipa v'sitra achra v'hi meslabeshes b'dam ha'adam lahachiyes haguf k'dechsiv ki nefesh habasar v'damhi. One soul is of the klipa and sitra achra, which we're going to discuss in a moment. This is the soul that invests itself within the blood to vitalize the body, as it says, for the vital soul of the body is in the blood. Now, what do we mean that the soul is in the blood? I mean, you can take as much blood as you want, you won't find a soul in there. Rather, what it's referring to is just like we talk about forces, right? A force that we can't see, the force of gravity. How do you sense gravity? Well, if you have matter, that's where the force of gravity manifests itself. And so too, the blood, sort of the wiring of our body that powers us and sends energy and commands to different parts of our body, that is where we would find this first soul. The main job of the first soul is to keep us alive. If it's there to keep us alive, why do we start off by saying it's a klippa and sitra achra, which the translation of klippa and sitra achra is a shell and the other side. Right? Euphemistically speaking, the other side is, of course, talking about the other side of God. God is holiness. Talking about unholiness, almost you could even say to the extent of evil, impurity. It's the other side. But as we'll continue to explain at length, let's talk a moment about klipa, about holiness versus unholiness. The world as we experience it, right, is a reality. Our world that we live in, our world that we interface with the world around us, we don't see godliness. Why not? Why don't we see godliness? If God created the world, right, in section 2 of Tanya, which I don't think we're going to get to, definitely not for over a year, but section 2 of Tanya discusses at length that the entire world is being powered by godliness. Then why don't we see that? This table, if God is created this table, and not only did he create it, but he's constantly created it, why don't I see the godliness in the table? And the answer is that there's a covering over that table. Although at its core, there is holiness within this table, there is a shell. There is a covering that we don't experience, we don't see, we don't perceive that holiness. Of course, that's by design, because if we spent the whole day walking around and seeing godliness, we'd be living in a godly world. There'd be nothing for us to do. The world is perfect, the world is great. That's the kind of world we'll have when Mashiach comes. However, the soul that the reality that we're talking about here, right? The soul, this first soul, is not necessarily evil. It's not bad per se. It is just selfish. Godliness, holiness, all of that is completely covered. And so when you have a person, when you have someone who's, a lot of life is a zero-sum game. It's either me or them. It's either God or not God. And so when we are talking about this second soul, what's wrong, quote unquote, with the soul? And we're about to say that there's a lot of things, all of our negative attributes, all the things we don't like about ourselves, all the things that we have to fix come from this soul. Not because it's evil, but because it's selfish. Because the godliness within it, God's reality, is completely covered up. And what happens if God's reality is completely covered up? Well, suddenly, it's just nature. What's the nature of the world? Survival of the fittest, everyone look out for themselves. All of those ideas that it's just selfishness is not inherently bad. Right? It's sometimes important to be selfish. What selfishness is a complete lack, a complete covering over godliness, as we'll continue to explain. So we've introduced this first soul that we have, that which is the soul that comes from the klippa. The klippa literally means shell. And that's because it's a shell over holiness. There's God's reality, but if you cover that with a shell, you can no longer perceive godliness, and all that's left is the pure nature of the world, the selfishness.
Why do we need a barrier, a shell? I don't understand.
So why can't we experience just pure godliness? That's a great question, and it could be a much longer discussion, but in short, just so we can keep moving, if we were to walk around seeing godliness, we wouldn't have free choice anymore. Because if God is obvious, then there would be no choice between doing good or bad. God wants himself to be hidden. And so now I have to make the conscious decision, and this will go into a lot of sort of why the world exists the way it does and why we have two souls, as we're going to explain over the next bunch of chapters. Continuing on the bottom of page 26. From this soul emerges all bad human traits that arise from the four bad elements of which the soul is comprised. Here, when we talk about the elemental forces here, we're going to talk about how there's four basic building blocks of creation. I apologize for those that don't have last week's booklet. We're just finishing up what I was hoping to cover last week, so hopefully there won't be too much overlap, generally speaking. On page 27, these four building blocks of creation are fire, water, earth, and air. And those are not literal building blocks, but those are sort of the four directions, the four, I'm going to use a very 2025 word, the four vibes that something can have. Right? The four ideas, the four feelings behind something, as we're going to see. On page 27, Kas v'gaiva, misoid ha'esh nigba l'mayla. Anger and arrogance arise from the element of fire. Just the fire lifts itself up. Right? Somebody has a burning anger, that the upward propulsion of anger and of arrogance, that we're constantly holding ourselves above other people, or the fiery passion of anger, those come from the elemental force of fire. The lust for pleasure arises from the element of water, just as it is water that allows all form of delight to sprout and grow. Everything physical in the world, I think besides for salt, and even that, lives in the ocean, can trace itself back. Every pleasure that we have can trace itself back to something that grows, something that is implanted. Either it itself grows from water, or it's the plant life which comes from water, or it's fed by everything roots back to water. Water is the life force of the world, which incidentally is why the Torah is compared to water, because the Torah is our spiritual life force.
It's also compared to fire.
It's also compared to fire. Yes, absolutely. But and so we have the element of water, and I will say, and I pointed this last week as well. On the bottom of the pages, you have those blue boxes, and I highly suggest, we're not going to be able to read them together. I want to be able to make some progress as we learn. But if you spend, it's a great opportunity to read those pages and to read them, learn them, and to sort of get some more context for these ideas that we are discussing. Page 28. Frivolity, mockery, boasting, and chattering arise from the element of air. Right? Air doesn't have sustenance. Air is a load of hot air. And so these wastes of time, these wastes of these false, empty ideas come from air. And finally, va'atzvus misoid ha'afer. Laziness and depression arise from the element of earth. The feeling of heaviness, the feeling of drowsiness, the feeling of being pulled down come from the elemental force of earth. Now, this is, just to be very, these ideas are pretty Kabbalistical, and so I don't want to get too distracted by the four elemental forces and what exactly comes from what. There's a lot we could discuss, and I encourage you to, the next time around when you learn Tanya, to spend some more time on these beautiful ideas. But for our purposes, someone's at the front door. These four ideas, the soul this first soul within us is the source for these negative attributes. How it comes down through these four elemental forces is not important for the flow of our ideas. But these four elemental forces, these negative attributes, come from the selfish soul, as we're calling it, which of course makes sense, right? If you cover over godliness, if my godly soul, as we're going to discuss in the coming chapter, my godly soul always wants to connect to God. It doesn't want to waste time. Depression, not and we'll discuss depression in about 25 chapters, and so I want to just put a pin in that. And here we're not talking about a medical, we're not talking about a chemical depression. We're talking about someone who's just unmotivated, someone who's having a hard time, someone who's going through a rough patch, and what we can do about that. The godly soul doesn't go through such feelings. It is completely motivated. It knows what its goal is, and that's what it wants to do. But all of these negative attributes come from the selfish soul. Why? Because godliness is completely covered up, and so what's left is our natural instincts. Now, what's interesting is that for a Jewish person, our natural instincts, we have some pretty good natural instincts as well. As we continue on page 28, not only these negative traits, but even the good qualities that are innate to every Jew from birth, such as compassion and acts of kindness, come from this soul. Because again, the one thing that I want to keep on reminding us about this soul is that this soul is not bad. This soul is just completely natural. It doesn't have godliness. And so the Jewish people, we have an innate quality of kindness, compassion, etc. Right? This goes back to our great-grandmother Rebecca and the famous story of how Rebecca was found. How did Eliezer, who was on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac, right? He was on a mission to find a wife, and he said, "How will I know who's the right girl? If she has this natural compassion, there's absolutely no reason she should do me a favor. I'm a grown man with a bunch of camels, but if she offers to give me water, I'll know that she has this compassion, she has the empathy that's needed to be a forebearer of the Jewish people." These natural instincts that the Jewish people have also comes from our natural soul. And in order to understand why...
Babies are pretty egotistical individuals.
Yes.
They don't seem to have a...
No, we talk about this nature. Obviously, we are over generalizing. There's some pretty kind Jewish people that I've met, some pretty Jewish people, some Jewish people who have completely covered over this natural instinct that we have. But talking on a soul level, the Jewish people have a natural instinct for kindness and compassion. Now, in order to understand why this is like this for the Jewish people, I want to take a second to go back and talk about the shell, the concept of a klippah. When we have the godly reality that we don't experience, why don't we experience? Because it's covered up. However, there are two types of covering that there could be. There is a translucent, a clear kind of covering, where it's still covered, but you can see through it. Some of the light shines forth. Right? If you ever if you ever slept in a bedroom that did not have blackout shades, you know what I'm talking about. The window's technically covered, but light still pours through. You can still sometimes even look out the window. It's not a complete barrier. That's one kind of covering. And as we're going to discuss throughout our discussions in Tanya, most of the world is that kind of covering. Going back to the table. Is this table godly? No. It's a physical table that I can't, it is what it is. However, when we stick four tables together and we sit here and we learn Torah on this table, what are we doing? We're extracting the holiness out of this table. Because the covering over this table, right, the external shell that covers over the holiness and the godliness within this table is translucent. It's very easy to break through it. However, to use a different example, pork, right? Non-kosher food. What kind of covering does that have? That has a completely impermeable covering. That's the blackout shade. No matter how much holiness you try to extract and how much you try to, do good things with the energy you do from non-kosher food, you could never extract that holiness. That holiness is completely off limits, completely untouchable. There is still a spark of holiness. Nothing in the world could exist without godliness, without God's spark energizing it. However, it's completely untouchable until Mashiach comes, as we're going to discuss. I think the motto for this class is going to be, as we will discuss further. Because a lot of these concepts, as Len was saying, there's a whole terminology you have to understand, and so therefore I'm giving the background and sort of to help us get through these chapters, but we're going to discuss these ideas much more at length as we continue studying. Yes?
So I see this scientifically, everything in the world is composed of atoms. And those atoms are a nucleus, and electrons are going there, and what's that energy that's making those electrons move? And that's
Exactly.
the spark of holiness.
100%. And I think, the atoms are a great example of that just because something is made up of atoms doesn't mean that I experience it and perceive it that way. Right? The table, I don't know what kind of atoms, and the difference between one type of material and another type of material is exactly how the nucleus lines up. I don't experience any of that. I see the outermost shell the way it's revealed to me. Now that we understand that this, right, so we know two pieces of information. We know that this soul comes from klippa, comes from the shell, the covering. Godliness is not apparent in this soul. And the second thing we know is that there's two versions of that. The Jewish soul, even this selfish soul, comes from the translucent, the clear klippa. And therefore, some of that godly light leaches through. And that's how we have our natural instincts for kindness and compassion, which, when we talk about kindness and compassion, we're not talking about being kind. There are people all over the world that are kind, and as we'll continue to discuss. We are talking about here about a true selfish level, like a young girl giving water to a grown man and all of his camels. That level of selfishness, that level of kindness and empathy, completely not self-serving at all, that comes from this Jewish soul. Why? Because the Jewish soul, even the second soul, comes from the translucent klippa, and therefore some of that godliness leaches through. And again, we'll understand more of this context as we discuss the godly soul in chapter 2. Continuing in the middle of page 28. Ki b'Yisrael nefesh zu de klipa, hi mi klipas noiga sheyesh ba gam kein toiv, v'hi misayed eitz adas toiv v'ra. Jacob, we're finishing up chapter 1. That's why we're still in last week's booklet. This is because in a Jew, this soul of klipa is of klipas noga, a kind of klipa that also contains some good, as is related in the inner meaning of the tree of knowledge, good and bad, by which good and bad become entangled. Masha'en kain nefesh umas ha'elam, heim mishar klipas tmeis she'ein bahen toiv klal, k'meshikasav be'etz ha'chayim shar memtes perigimel. This is not the case with the souls of the other nations of the world. They are not of klipas noga, but of the other impure klipas that have no good in them at all, as written in Eitz Chaim, Portal 49, Section 3. And so again, when we say here there's no good in them at all, what do we mean? We mean that there could be no good, kind people in the world? Of course not. What we mean here is that there is no, that godliness, that pure God perspective doesn't shine through from their soul because it's covered in this impermeable klippa.
So they don't have a translucent.
They do not. Their soul is covered in a full. The
Like the pork.
Yes, exactly. And what that means is that for them, anything they do, right? If you this, essentially the rules that they live by are not good or bad. They are natural, right? The sort of the rules of self-preservation, the rules of survival of the fittest, all of those ideas that we use to understand the world around us, the psychology of people, the philosophy of why people do what they do, all of that applies to the nations of the world because their soul has no godliness. All that has no godliness, the godliness is not revealed, and therefore, all that we can understand by is why would you do something? Well, either because it's selfish, or there's sort of these of course people could do selfless things, but you think, why did they do that? Are they trying to get something out of it? Is there a long-term strategy, or did they evolve? Did their souls sort of evolve to appreciate that by doing good now, good will come to them later? But for whatever the philosophical and psychological reasons that science has been discussing for the past thousands of years of why people do what they do, that is why that applies to the other nations of the world. As we continue on page 29, they do good, They do good, but any good the nations do, they do for their own selves. It is self-serving, not genuine good. Again, when we say genuine good here, we're talking about a pure, godly, just for the sake of godliness, as we'll continue to understand. This main point is made in the Talmud on the verse, the kindness of the nation is sin. The rabbis explain that all the charity and kindness done by all the nations of the world is only in order to feed their pride over others. Which is, they were living in the times of the Romans, and for them, that was very much what they were experiencing. But the crux of that conversation is the understanding of the difference between this first soul in the Jew versus the non-Jew. Is it possible for there to be altruistic good? Is it possible to have complete and total selflessness? And so here the Alter Rebbe posits that it's not. There is that delineation. In other places it's explained more in depth, and the reason why it's glossed over here is because here we're not talking about everything. We're not talking about souls. Here we're talking about the Jewish people. And so we're just bringing this to juxtapose how what makes a Jewish person tick. But in other places where it goes more in depth, there is the concept of the righteous Gentiles of the world, which of course over the last 75 years has become a term that we're all familiar with, that it is possible for a non-Jewish person to experience this as well, that it is possible for them to have a soul that has this translucent klipa. However, they are the exception that proves the rule, as the Jewish people have experienced time and time again.
You think the fact that the Alter Rebbe sees the Goyim nations as kind of negative is because he was persecuted, he was powerless, he lived in a society where the Jews had very little power.
And so I want to push back a little bit on the wording that you used, because he doesn't see them as negative. He sees them as natural. Right? Naturally, the natural instinct of humanity is sometimes we do good, sometimes we do bad, sometimes we're selfish, most of the time we're selfish, and most of the time there is what do I want out of this? That is our natural instinct, and that's what everyone in the world has. The Jewish people were God's chosen people. We have some. God chose us. It wasn't just for fun. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. God changed something within us that makes us chosen, and that is first of all the second soul that we're about to discuss, but also in that soul number one, that ours has a much looser covering, and therefore that godliness can leach through. Now, throughout the generations, I've seen that explanation as well. The reason why the Alter Rebbe doesn't focus on the concept of the righteous Gentiles of the world is because he didn't experience that. That wasn't the reality living in 18th and 19th century Russia. But the idea of the non-Jewish soul, this is sort of the only time we'll discuss it, because again, that's not the topic that we're having here. Here we are discussing what makes the Jewish person tick. Any other questions before we move on? All right, so we're going to skip ahead to page 37. This is the new booklet that you have in front of you, chapter 2. So to summarize, if we were to summarize chapter 1, sort of what we need for the flow, what is chapter 1 about? Chapter 1 is the questions that set up the whole Tanya that we discussed last week. And chapter 1 is also soul number 1. The natural soul, the selfish soul that we all possess. Chapter 2, page 37.
So there's the first soul controls the physical part, that's the physical soul?
We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss over the coming chapters what exactly is it. In very short, the answer is that is the battle of life, is which soul is in control. The second soul in a Jew is a part of God from beyond in actual fact. Every single Jewish person has a soul within us which is a piece of God. And not just any piece of God. When we talk about a piece of God, continuing on page 38, the Torah describes how God created all things, including Adam, by simply speaking them into existence. But when it came to giving Adam a soul, rather than speaking, he exhaled into his nostrils the breath of life. This is not only true of Adam, but this second soul of every Jew, as we say in our morning prayers, my God, the soul that you have placed within me is pure, you have created it You have formed it, you have exhaled it into within me. Now, the wording here is exact. Both when we're talking about the soul that God blew into Adam and the soul that we say every morning in our prayer that God exhaled into us, that there's a huge difference between talking, right? The entire world was brought into existence through talking. God spoke and the world came into being. And then there's the world, then there's the things that God blew. What's the difference between blowing and talking? The Zohar explains the metaphor of exhaling. When you exhale, it says, you exhale from within yourself, meaning from your innermost. When you exhale forcefully, you exert your innermost life energy. God injected his innermost life energy into Adam, and the same with every Jew. When God blew this soul into us, just like, you can talk for hours and hours and hours. Why can you talk for hours at a time? Because it's not coming from deep within you. It's not a injection it's not an energy intensive idea. Why? Because it's just surface level. You're talking, the air's coming in through your nose, out through your mouth. It's not coming from deep within you. When you blow, it's coming from deep within you. It's coming from your lungs, and therefore there's a limit to how much you can blow at one time before you have to recharge. And the reason we have that difference is because when God created the world, certain things were created through speech. God brought everything into the world through speech. And although God created it, it wasn't coming from God's innermost essence. It's coming from external layers of God, which we'll put a pin in that entire discussion of layers of godliness, because that's a much longer, more in-depth conversation. But we can understand that godliness, when God spoke and the world came into being, that's coming from a more external layer, just like talking isn't coming from deep within us. When God blew the soul into Adam and into every one of us, that's coming from a much deeply rooted source within them. So, the idea of souls coming into this world, whether through talking or through blowing, the Alter Rebbe is now going to explain that concept through a metaphor. And the metaphor is the reproductive system. Because if we think about the connection between a father and son, the investment, the genetic material that a father uses to create a child comes from a very deeply rooted place within them. For a person to make things, to just use his hands, it's very easy. There's no the level of investment, the level of personal injection that the father invests into the son is much, much deeper than any surface level thing that he creates with his hands, etc. Continuing on the bottom of page 38, Kach al derech mashal, the same idea of God placing his innermost within us lies behind another Torah metaphor. Neshamas Yisrael alu b'machshava, k'dichsiv b'ni b'chei Yisrael banat Hashem lekechem. The sages say that Israel aroused in thought. They mean by this that we are his children. As it says, my child, my firstborn Israel, and you are children of God, your God. The Jewish people are called God's children. Why? Why are we specifically singled out as God's children more than anyone else? Perush, k'moshe haben nimshach b'moyach ha'av. What's the connection between arising in thought and being a child of God? Because a child is extracted from the brain of the father, his most essential, innermost faculty. Kach kaviyachol, neshama is called ish Yisrael nimshecha mimachshavte v'chachmasi yisbarich. So too, this is on page 39. Anthropomorphically speaking, the soul of every Jew is extracted from God's innermost life energy, his quintessential faculties of thought and wisdom. She is not just one of God's thoughts, but something of God's mind that thinks those thoughts. So, we're going to split this paragraph into two, because I want to summarize what we're saying till now, and then we're going to get into a deeper idea. Right, we're talking about the makeup of the Jewish soul, of this second soul, the neshama, as we colloquially will call it, the Jewish soul, the second godly soul within us. And so the first thing the Alter Rebbe establishes is that this is not just another thing that God creates. This comes from deep within God's essence. Now, the problem is that we're using the metaphor of God's brain. Now, as much as a brain is, the thoughts that come up in our brain are not our innermost essence. I can think about anything, right? And most of our day is spent with thoughts that we don't control. So why are we using this metaphor? If we're describing that the Jewish soul comes from God's innermost essence, the quintessential godliness, why are we using the metaphor of thought specifically? Thought is pretty external to who we are, relatively speaking. So the Alter Rebbe will now describe how for God, God's wisdom and for God, His wisdom is His innermost essence. Why? So continuing on page 40. In what way does God's wisdom represent His innermost? Certainly, God is not defined or described by His wisdom. He is beyond all description at all. The answer is that God is wise, but not with knowable wisdom. Rather, He and His wisdom are one. The Rambam explains this unity, saying, He is the mind that knows, and He is the knower that knows, and the mind, He knows with the mind, and He is the knowledge that is being known. God is His wisdom, while simultaneously He is God, the one who is knowing through the wisdom. So the Alter Rebbe is explaining here is that when we use metaphors for godliness, it's important to remember that they don't line up exactly. Obviously, we're talking about God. We're just trying to relate to ideas that we can understand. And so if we think about something that we know, right? We know math. So there's me, my quintessential personhood, however you would define that. There is the knowledge, right? The 1 + 1 = 2. And then there is my brain that I use to understand, to process that information. So for us, we have those three distinct ideas. There's me, the knower. There is the knowledge, and the faculties, right? There's the knower, the knowledge, and the brain. Three distinct things. But for God, those are all the same thing. God is both what is being known. Right? When we talk about God knows something, what does God know? There is nothing else besides for God. What does God have to understand? Everything is God. So God is the knowledge, God is the knower, and God is also the quote-unquote brain that's being used to process information. Anybody confused? Yeah? Great. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. As we finish up on the bottom of page 40, that's why, as the Rambam notes, a lucid grasp of this divine intellect is beyond human reach, because it is one with God. And understanding God is beyond our reach. As it says, if you will seek God with your intellect, will you find Him? Just the same, you can't understand His mind, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, and the heavens are beyond the earth. Trying to understand God, how God works, trying to understand anything about God is beyond us. By definition, because knowledge about God is God, it's beyond us.
God gave us revelation, and He gave us prophecy.
Exactly. But that is filtered through ways that we can understand. The metaphor itself, the concept of a metaphor, is because we can't truly understand God. Right? That's why prophets talk in metaphors. They talk in, the Torah, the written Torah as we have it, talks about sheep and goats and stealing and paying and killing and robbing. That's God's wisdom. It is filtered down through metaphors. And this really touches on what we discussed last week about the hidden Torah and the revealed Torah. Why is the hidden Torah hidden? Because it's so much harder. In order to really understand it, you need to have context, you need to have a teacher, you need to have guidance, because trying to understand God is impossible. All we can do is to use the words that God, the revelation as Len called it, the ideas that God allows us to understand, to try to put some pieces together. And this gets truer and truer at the level as we climb, into more innermost aspects of God. When we try to understand things closer and closer into God's essence, it's impossible for us to truly understand it. So as continue on page 41. So the divine mind that truly does represent God himself as he is one with him. The divine soul that begins with a sample of this divine mind is therefore a part of God's innermost, ungraspable innermost. Now, again, on the bottom, there's those highlighted, the shaded box on the bottom for some more context and some more words. But for the purpose of our understanding, for what the Tanya is trying to teach us, to understand our psyche, the main thing we have to know is that we have a second soul that comes from God's essence. And why that's going to be important is because when we allow that soul to be in the driver's seat, what motivates that soul? Godliness. Connecting to God. That's the only thing. Our natural soul, what motivates our natural soul? Our natural instinct, which, as we'll discuss, you can refine and you can channel into the correct ideas. But generally speaking, our animal soul, our natural soul wants natural things. It wants the world around us. It's selfish. What does the godly soul want? Godliness. It wants to connect to God. It wants to do what God wants, even if it's completely against what we would naturally be pulled towards. That is what we are understanding now in the premise that the Alter Rebbe is establishing, the concept of the two souls. And we'll unpack this over the coming chapters about how that affects our life, and we'll start to recognize the patterns within us based on which soul we're allowing to control ourselves. But for right now, we have the concept of the two souls. We have the natural soul that we discussed at the end of chapter 1, and we have the godly soul that we are talking about now. The rest of chapter 2 is sort of a technical question that the Alter Rebbe asks. We just established that what is the godly soul? A piece of God's innermost essence. Now, by definition, if we are talking about God's innermost essence, there can only be one, right? God's innermost essence there's no different versions, there's no different levels. The innermost essence of godliness is just one. Right? Think about ourselves. There's many ways that I can act. There's many, externally, I can divide myself into I'm in good moods, I'm in bad moods, I'm having a good time, a bad time, my right arm, my left arm. There's ways that we can divide ourselves. But if we're able to somehow zoom in and just focus on my essence, on who I am, there's just one of them. And so the question the Alter Rebbe posits here is that if there's only one essence of God, how could you have different souls? And as he'll explain, there are different souls. Within ourselves, we have different levels of soul. And so if we just said that our godly soul comes from God's essence, how could there be any distinctions? God is one. His essence is one. How could there be distinctions in souls? And this is what the Alter Rebbe starts to ask and explain on page 42. Yet we find that not all souls are equal. There are tens of thousands of different sorts of levels of souls, each extending higher and higher without end. If all souls are of one divine origin, then that origin is a perfect oneness. How is it that there are different levels of souls? Is the question clear? It's sort of the idea that the Alter Rebbe is asking is God's essence is one. Right? God's essence is not divisible. There's not different levels to it, because as soon as you start putting levels, as soon as you start putting distinctions, it's not essence anymore. The essence of a person, the essence of an idea has to be one, because as soon as you start dividing it, as soon as you start saying there's distinctions, it's no longer the essence by definition. And so the question that the Alter Rebbe asks is, how do we have different levels? Now, how do I know that there are different levels in soul? Maybe he's right. Everyone's soul is exactly the same, and there is no difference. But the Alter Rebbe will say that we know from other parts of the Torah and from our own personal experience that there are different levels of soul. Compare, for example, the great level of the souls of our forefathers and Moses to the level of the souls of our generation. The entirety of all Jewish souls over the ages are a kind of body, in which our souls today are on the heels of Mashiach. We are the heels relative to those souls that are the head and the brain of our people. It says, generationally speaking, the generation of Moses, Abraham, and Moses, and their generations, their souls were much higher than ours. And this is not us just self-deprecating. We are called, the period of time that we are now, sort of the tail end of history, we're the heels of Mashiach. Now, literally, what that means is that we can hear the footsteps of Mashiach. We're at the final moments. But the reason why we use specifically that word, we're the heels of Mashiach, is, I think the English equivalent would be we're the tail end. We're at the very, very end, the lowest parts. We are the bottom of the barrel, soul level speaking. If we are the bottom of the barrel, how could you have a top and bottom? How could you have the head, Moses and his generation? Chassidus and Kabbalah discuss the levels of the soul that they experienced, that they had. How could we have different levels? If our souls all come from the same source, how could you have different levels of soul? So generationally speaking, we have different levels of soul. But also, within every generation, there's the great tzaddikim, they're the leaders, the rabbis, the people that are very, very close, very, very spiritual, very connected to God. And then there's the rest of us. Are our souls at the same level? Do we really want to try to say that we experience godliness, that our soul is connecting on the same level as a tzaddik who spends his entire day in prayer and Torah study? V'chein b'chol dor v'dor, yesh rasha alfi Yisrael shenishmeseim he bechinas reish v'meyach lagabe nishames hamayim v'amei eretz. The same is true when comparing souls within any one generation. In every generation, there are those who are called the heads of the myriads of Israel. Their souls are like the heads and brains relative to the souls of the masses of the common people. And so even within our soul itself, I referenced this earlier, the neshama, the general term for the godly soul, is actually comprised of a bunch of different levels. Some of them you might be familiar with. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida. Our soul, even the word soul that our godly soul has different parts. There are the lower parts that run my body when it's in control. There are the higher parts that are connected to God. How do you have different levels of souls, both within ourselves, within our generation, and within the context of Jewish history? That is the question that the Alter Rebbe is asking here. How do we have different levels of soul? If every soul comes from the same oneness, that perfect moment of godliness, that perfect essence of godliness, how do you have different levels? As he finishes up the question on page 43, we call sherish kol nefesh ruach neshama mireish kol madrigas zev kol dargin melubesh beguf va'amei aretz v'kal shebekalim nimshach memayach ha'elyon shehi chachma ilah kaviyachol. Yet despite all these distinctions, every nefesh ruach of neshama, of every single soul, from the highest level to the highest of levels to the lowest, to those souls invested in the body of the common people, and even the most base and materialistic Jews, are all rooted in the same divine source, that which we call the higher mind, meaning divine wisdom. If you look at the worst Jewish person you know, he has the same soul as me. They have the exact same soul as me, coming from the same essence of God, and not only as me, they have the exact same soul as Moses. How does that make sense? If you look at their life, you look at who they are, and compare that with Moses, night and day. And so the Alter Rebbe is now going to explain the process by which this soul, this essence of godliness, comes down into the world and comes down to be invested in my body. And the metaphor he's going to use goes back to that metaphor of the father creating a child. Because if we think about it, the genetic material that the father contributes to the equation through the 9 months of pregnancy, that same genetic material develops into the very brain of the child and to the toenails and to the hair. How does that happen? Well, because you take the same essence and it gets processed and diluted and changed, and every part of it evolves in a different way. And that's what happens with our souls as well. Although at the core, our soul is the same, on its way down into this world, different souls have very, very different experiences. Just like different parts of the baby's body have different things that happen to it, and that's why it develops, one part of it develops into a brain, and the other part develops into a toenail.
Can we elevate the soul?
Absolutely. And we're gonna talk about that more. But I'll say we don't have to elevate the soul. We have to uncover and drill down and find that essence, because that essence is always there, as we're going to continue to explain for the rest of the chapter. The bottom of page 43. To understand this, let's return to the metaphor of a child who emerges from the father's brain. Through a 9-month gestation in the mother's womb, every detail of the child down to the toenail emerges from just that one initial sampling. V'yarda mi madrega la madrega of page 44. Now, how does that happen? How does that same genetic material develop into the toenails? It steps through many phases of diminishing complexity into yet more specific and simpler cells in gradual metamorphosis until it reaches the seemingly lifeless stage of the toenails. Now, that toenail, does that still have a connection to the father? Is there still a link between the child's toenail and the father? Of course there is. And in the modern day world, it's very easy to prove that. Because if you were to take that toenail and run a DNA test on it, you can match who the father is. Why? Because no matter how much that genetic material is processed, it's still, its source, its essence, is still from the father. As the Alter Rebbe continues to explain, yet even then, it remains connected and actually one in a wondrous and powerful bond with its original essence and being, just as when it was an instance of the father's brain. Now, this connection works in two ways. First of all, as we just said, even after the child is born, even after the child is 70 years old, that same toenail still has, we would call the DNA connection to the father. We can still source it back to its source. Another thing also is that the child's brain is a much closer copy and a much closer connection to the father's brain. You see a kid acting, you can usually connect who their parent is. We just spent a couple of weeks with my parents, and my parents are really enjoying seeing my son acting and having memories of the way I acted when I was his age. Why? Because the child's brain, the child's personality is a lot more of a closer connection to the father. I'm sorry?
Nothing with the mother.
The process of the mother as well is is of course an important part, and that's what we're going to be discussing. That's what makes the changes, right? Because again, I want to just take a moment to step back, because it's vitally important as we learn Chassidus not to get too hung up on the parables, on the metaphors, because obviously God is not a father and God is not a mother. God is both, right? God created us in humans that requires a mother and a father, and a mother and a father have different contributions and different roles to play. In God, there's God's essence, which plays the role of the father, and then there's the rest of godliness and the rest of the worlds that develop and process and turn the soul into what it is, which that plays the role of the mother. But right now we're going back to the essence core of where our soul comes from, which that comes from, quote unquote, the father, the role that God plays as the father, as just that core source.
Problem with our society that so many kids don't have fathers bringing them up.
Both of those roles are very important. Both of them have their place, and in godliness, right? The question of, is God male or female? Yes, he's both. Depending on what role we're talking about, God plays the role of the male, of the giver, of that initial investment. God also plays the role of the mother, of the processing and the developing and the nurturing and turning us into who we are. Right now, we're talking about the role of the father. And so, the second connection that the toenail has back to the father is that what's causing the toenail to grow? The child's brain. That child's brain, of course, has a much closer connection to the father's brain. You can see that connection a lot clearer. Now, genetically speaking, both the brain and the toenail are connected to the father. You don't need, the toenail, even if it's severed from the brain, still has that connection to the father, genetically speaking. But practically speaking, the brain has a much closer connection to the father, and that serves as a link that the toenail, even in its current form, as it's growing, what's causing it to grow? The child's brain, which is connected back to the father's brain. This connection is not only expressed in the genesis of each cell of the fetus, even when this child emerges as his own being, this core identity ensures in every part of him, down to the fingernails. That's because the essential vitality of the fingernail and their experience of life comes from the child's brain, where the original sample of the father's brain remain unaltered. Indeed, the Talmud in the passage Nida cited in chapter 1 confirms that toenails do not emerge from some extraneous cause. As it states, from the white semen of the father comes the sinews, bones, and nails of the child. From this we see that even the fingernails, as lifeless as they appear, extend from the same source as the rest of the body. Of course, before we had modern biology, we had the Talmud, which tells us exactly how the human body develops from the wisdom of the Torah. And so the Talmud already expresses this point that every single detail of the child, from the brain down to the toenail, come from the initial soul of the initial brain and genetic sample from the father. This is on page 45. This is a Kabbalistical parenthesis, so we'll just read it. This is also reflected on a Kabbalistic level. Several Midrashic sources say that Adam, while in the Garden of Eden, was initially clothed in a shiny layer of the same material as fingernails. This inner meaning is provided in the Eitz Chaim Shar Chashmal, which explains that this is a kind of a containment originating in the cosmic mind. Once again, the origin of the most extraneous, seemingly lifeless part of the body is in the brain. That's just an interesting factor that before clothing were invented, originally when Adam was created, what was his protective layer, if they didn't have clothing, was they had fingernail-like material over their entire body. Once they sinned with the tree, that was taken away, and that's actually the source of the custom. For those that have watched the Havdalah service, we say the blessing on the fire, and we hold up our fingernails to the candle. Why? Because the whole idea of Havdalah is about connecting to the week ahead, which the first time that happened was Adam and Eve. Saturday night, they were getting ready to enter the real world. And one of the biggest things that they lost was that now their fingernails only cover the end of the fingers, not their entire body. And so we're sort of mourning that and alluding to that idea by focusing on our fingernails during Havdalah. This is, again, a Kabbalistical paragraph. We're not going to focus on that. So, to summarize, and I apologize once again, we did not manage to finish the chapter. And so next week we'll finish up chapter. Next week we'll finish up chapter 2, God willing. But what we've established so far in chapter 2 is the idea of the second soul. Every single Jewish person has two souls. Soul number 1 is the natural soul, we'll call it the animalistic soul, because as we'll continue to discuss, it works on instinct, it works on what it naturally has a pull to, just like an animal. And then we have the godly soul, which is altruistic, which is connected to God, which it is motivated by its connection to God, as we'll continue to discuss over the coming chapters. And we started to address a fascinating question of, if everyone's soul comes from the same place, how do we have different levels of soul? How does one person have a soul of Moses and another person has a soul of someone else? And so we gave the parable. We gave the idea of that, just like with a child, that the entire body of a baby comes from the same source, but of course through the process of pregnancy, different parts emerge, and different, you have a brain and you have toenails, and as we'll continue to explain next week, God willing, that is also what happens to the soul. Is that yes, there is that initial source that's sourced in God's oneness, in God's essence, but the process of how that essence gets turned into an actual soul causes there to be different levels of souls within different people, as we will explain, God willing, next week. So next week, just remember to bring the chapter 2 booklet back so we can finish up chapter 2 next week.
Thank you, Yashikar.
Are you able to